the back of those stories, we want to now take a discussion towards the economy and the immense task that faces government now with the electioneering period largely over. Once the swearing in happens, what needs to happen next? Now, some highlights of the president's speech did talk about things like social housing, 500,000 units that are expected to be put into the hands of owners over the next 5 years, rather. And this, of course, expected to be in affordable housing sector. Well, to give us some insight into things like that and what it will mean and what we will need to do to achieve that, Chris Grune is here in studio. He is MD at Barani Capital, co-founder. Karibu sana. Now, first off, I'm sure you did listen into some of what the president did have to say about the economy. General overview, what was your impression?
Right. Well, it was a very, I think, a hopeful commentary. And, you know, I think he laid out, some of the areas he laid out are also some of the areas where we're seeing the biggest opportunities. And there are also some of the areas where I think there's the biggest need for investment.
Well, when we look at the country as it is right now, about 50% of the country disenfranchised. As a result, economic activity largely down and that sort of thing. In a previous reincarnation in the year 2007, in coming out of that time, we went into what was called the economic stimulus period. What needs to happen this time around?
I could say that I think that we probably could use some economic stimulus, especially coming out of the second half of the year.
Yes.
Conditions have been pretty tough. So I think that if additional lending could be encouraged, infrastructure spending, things like that, which will really inject funds into the economy.
Well, one of the things he directly mentioned was the housing sector. One sticking point, especially for the opposition, has been the cost of living in Nairobi, especially around rents. What can be done in the near term to start to address those sorts of things, especially when he says that we intend to put up these number of houses in 5 years? What needs to happen?
Certainly. I think this is an area where there's a clear demand, a clear need for a lot of new units.
Yes.
There's quite a lot of interest as well in terms of offshore investors, and those are the investors that we speak to probably most often. And it's a combination of finding affordable funding to do the projects, but there's the aspect of the building technology, finding new types of materials to build the projects, and but those are actually, that's one of the areas that I'm currently looking at is different affordable housing projects, and things like student housing as well,
yes.
Where there's a clear gap in terms of the supply and the demand.
When we look at the demand that you're saying and the gap that exists currently, and then the fact that we are not able to fund this locally due to various reasons, either the way we've structured our savings, most Kenyans don't save anyway, the organizations which hold a lot of our long-term funds are heavily invested in things like government bonds and other sorts of government paper. What needs to happen, essentially, so that we don't continue to focus heavily on foreign borrowing to start to bring in these funds into Kenya, especially bearing in mind that the alarm bells around foreign debt have already been set off?
Sure. Well, the private sector is going to be key. I've said that always, that even if the multilateral agencies and you know, if the government is the one spending, that's still, you still need a huge private sector involvement. But speaking about financial services and savings, the projects need to, the returns on the projects need to be competitive compared to government bonds. So, for example, if rates came down, that would encourage more flows into these types of investment projects. And in fact, financial services and fintech in particular is another area that I think there are a lot of opportunities that we're currently looking at, and that is also a way to encourage people to save and then channel more money into areas like mortgage, mortgage lending, for example, which is still a very, very small part of the Kenyan economy.
Yes, earlier on today I saw a discussion around mortgages and the fact that for a house in, for example, the Embakasi area of Nairobi, if it costs about 7 million shillings. If you're given 240 months to repay that, it comes to about 90 shillings, 1,000 shillings a month. A probable rent more in the region of some maybe 30, 40,000 shillings. So there is a clear distortion, it would seem, in these sort of areas. What are the sort of policy measures that we can look to start addressing these sort of skews in the market? Look at the price of land currently and things like that.
Sure. Well, the price of land has been, I think that in certain areas the prices have risen so quickly. But right now, I think, in certain areas, there's a lack of supply. So I think that affordable, I would say even sort of in the 4 to 5 million shilling range, there's definitely too few of those types of units. In terms of policies, I would say just consistency in terms of the policies and in terms of the incentives to get investors into that segment of the economy. And again, and I think bringing equity investors, bringing foreign investors to come in and invest in those projects, because, and I always pound the table about the fact that most of the world is still at very low interest rates. So the returns here are attractive, and they should be pulling in more, I think, private and especially foreign investment.
Finally, and very quickly, what are the key things we need to get right over the next 5 years? If you had a crystal ball and could say that it is 1, 2, 3 things, what are those?
Sure. In a lot of ways, there are lots of opportunities. It's just to, I guess, not discourage them. I think that the money is definitely there to come in and fund those areas. And so the consistency, I would say definitely consistency in terms of policies, in terms of regulation, in terms of licensing and things like that. I'll give you an example. We have the mining forum coming up at the beginning of next month, and that's been an area where Kenya has historically been ranked fairly low. But there are a lot of opportunities for the sector here. And so just getting the policies and the regulations right, and then letting them continue so that there's predictability in terms of some of the long-term investments that need to be made. And that's really it. I think the needs and the opportunities are there. The money is available. It's just to lay the groundwork and allow for these long-term investments to be made with confidence.
Okay. Indeed, thank you very much. Chris Grune, MD at Barani Capital, for your time.
And can I mention, we do have our gala dinner and awards tomorrow night. We have 22 new charter holders. The CFA is a Chartered Financial Analyst. And we have 22 new charter holders tomorrow, and it should be a very enjoyable event. We have 800 800 candidates for the exam every year, so we're growing by leaps and bounds.
Wow. 800 candidates, just 21 gained the charter. Impressive ratio, very tight numbers. But thank you very much, sir, for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you, Peter.
Well, away from